Good morning and half a day, Senators. The Committee in the Whole is now reconvened on the ongoing discussion on Bill number 157-34 COR as amended by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication. I'd like to recognize all the Senators who are presently in the Hall. We have Speaker Cruz, Vice Speaker Talahi, Senator San Nicolas, Senator Joe San Agustin, Senator Tom Ada, Senator Mary Torres, Senator Luis Muñe, and Senator Will Castro. I understand the other Senators are in transit. So we're going to proceed and continue where we left off yesterday. Just for the information of the body, the representative from the Guam Economic Development Authority is in transit. She's going to try to make her way here as quickly as possible. So if there's any questions from any members of the body that would be directed directly towards Gita, I will give us the opportunity to be able to come back and pose those questions should you have the floor on the discussion of the proposed measure. Vice Speaker Talai, we concluded our conversation, our discussion on page 33 after the disposition of an amendment that you proffered. You have the floor, Vice Speaker Talai.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Most of the questions that I have are probably for Gita, but for example, I just want to point out on page 37, I'm hoping we can verify the citation in subsection G. It's the same error that I think was made in a prior section. But, well, when we ended yesterday, we were on page
33.
33, and these are all subsections to 10210 on page 28, which began on page 28. And I think everyone here in the legislature, we understand that the port needs to make repairs and to rebuild. And we are told by our financial advisors at Gita that the only way to do this immediately is to borrow. And the PUC says that also. That's the realistic
Actually,
option.
Madam Vice Speaker, we can just, for clarity purposes, one option is to borrow. The other option is to allow the Port Authority to approach the Public Utilities Commission and significantly increase the tariffs so that it can cover some of the anticipated requirements for the critical facility upgrade. So that's where really
well,
this
that's
body,
what they did. They approached the
PUC
PUC and asked for a tariff increase in order to borrow. That's exactly what we're looking at right now.
Yes, that's correct.
Is following their request. Okay, and they're told that we don't have time to save up these increased tariffs and, you know, save up enough to do all of the repair that's needed immediately. So we all understand that, and I appreciate that it's being brought to us. But we also know that the borrowing comes at a very great cost, and that it's the legislature's job to set a cap on the amount so that we can control what we, the government, can afford and what our children are going to have to pay. It's also the legislature's job to set a cap on the interest rate on that borrowing. And it's also our job to scrutinize the terms of the borrowing and put limits on those terms as much as we can. It's all part of why the legislature is reviewing borrowing at all. I think we are here acting on behalf of the people of Guam in deciding what we will concede, what we have to concede in order to get that cash. And so I was defeated yesterday in, I don't know how many motions to remove subsections from section 10210, and these subsections I thought were too much to give up for this cash. And that if we could, that we should try and negotiate, try our best to negotiate not to give up that autonomy of the ports and that flexibility of the entire government of Guam in order that it's the government of Guam's ability to, at its port, protect from illegal activity, protect from invasive species, allow for future growth, and things that we just don't know right now. But nevertheless, I feel very, very honored and glad to be in the legislature during this time, even though my motions did not pass, but because I feel like this is a rare opportunity for us here on Guam to actually have in front of us very clearly the provisions that I think have really caused the government of Guam and the people of Guam frustration and you know, we've been perplexed at why the government of Guam is not able to do certain things. Why, when our mothers or fathers are in the hospital, headlines might read, GPA threatens to shut off the hospital's power, or DOE's power, or why customs is, why when we all know we need customs at the airport, we have to pay to have customs operate at the airport for the benefit of all of us. We have to charge extra to our passengers and airlines for this government law enforcement service. These things I have always been perplexed with, and I believe the people of Guam, they're very smart, they're also perplexed with this type of thing. When we know, because everybody knows, every autonomous agency of Guam received almost everything they have from the government of Guam. They received the land, the assets, the money from the government of Guam, from the people of Guam. And so I just want to, if we can, and if we are told we absolutely can't, then that's a different story. But I believe it's time for us to try and to just set some limits in these indentures that will not restrict us in the future from cooperation between agencies that is absolutely, and as even the port admits, beneficial to all of us. And that's how I want our government to operate. And I don't want to give that up just for cash. So I'm going to try one more time on this section, Mr. Chair, and this section is actually just a section that says for all future covenants, these are things that the board might include or not include. And as was pointed out by my colleague, that the board might also deem necessary advisable terms that are not in front of us today. So I would actually like to delete this section, delete this authority of the board to put in any kind of indenture that it wants, and just let's stick to the indentures that are being recommended for this one particular revenue bond today. And so I would move to delete this section 10210, starting on page 28.
There's a motion by the Vice Speaker to delete subsection 10210.
It's on page 28.
Any discussion on that particular motion? And just for your information, Senators, it begins on page 28 through page 33 to delete subsection 10210. Any discussion on the proposed amendment?
Yeah. Mr. Chair.
Yes, Senator San, you recognize.
She's requesting to delete line 10210.
Page 28, section 10210, the entire subsection.
Can we have a recess, Mr. Chair?
So I'm just trying to understand is that you want to delete what the board or the authority may be asking in the future, the allowance, and just say, no, you cannot ask for anything unless they ask the legislature? I think I've heard it for the past 2 days. We're nickeling and diming it. I'm just concerned is that I don't want us to be micromanaging the port or any agency, because there's GPA's next. And if we're going to do this to the port, then I agree we have to also watch everybody else. And I want to give the benefit of the doubt that the board and the authority has put their heart into this bill or this proposal, and I'm just trying to be very careful on how we want to take out certain things on the bill, Mr. Chairman, when we end up with not much of a bill. And every time we make changes, we might end up going back to a public hearing. And that's why I try to leave it alone and work it and see how we can maybe add on. Maybe add on that they get the advice of the legislature, if anything, if that may be needed. I mean, instead of deleting it, maybe come back to us and ask us, is this okay? It's still within the Port Authority. It's still what we need. It's what the people of Guam will be expecting. When they go to the stores, they're going to be looking at that shelf and saying, how come we didn't get this? Well, because the port can't bring in the goods, can't offload the ship. They can't store their equipment. Their equipment's falling apart because the Guam legislature prevented this from happening. Okay, I'm just trying to be very careful about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator San Agustin. And just to add to Senator San Agustin's comments, any and all loans or bond financing has to come before this body for concurrence. So, and as a matter of fact, it's reflective in the next legislation that will be discussed during this session. Thank you, Senator San Agustin. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? Senator Nelson?
Can we just have a couple minutes recess to look over this complete subsection, Mr. Chair? Just 3 minutes, maybe?
Let me see if there's anyone else that would like to discuss it, and then I'll come back to you, Senator Nelson. Any other members that would like to discuss? Senator Torres, you're recognized on the proposed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm getting increasingly concerned about what we're doing with this bill and how we're addressing Section 1. And what concerns me the most is we sat for the past couple of days listening to a representative from GITA, who is the person that goes out to the bond market and secures the bonds on behalf of the government of Guam. Not all, but perhaps many, if not most. And what thought hung on me yesterday was whether, when she discussed, Mrs. Garcia discussed how the language that is contained in Article 2 is what is applicable to the terms and conditions of the issuance and sale of bonds in present day. And from what I understood, the reason that we are rewriting, striking out the old statute and replacing it with this new one is to provide language that is modern, that replaces antiquated language, and that will in fact facilitate the sale and issuance of bonds for the port. I understand the need and the want to have control and to be in a position to call your terms. And that is notable. But I also understand that there are different categories of entitlement to call your own terms and to set your own parameters. And when you're in a position where we're at right now, where we've never gone out to borrow for the port, all the monies that have been given to the port were grants and perhaps some matching funds associated with them, but they were outright issuances of funds from the federal government to the port. We don't have the benefit of precedence. We don't have the benefit of a stellar credit rating. We don't have many benefits that would entitle us to be so bold as to say, this is what I want, I expect that you will give me this, but only on my terms. That's what's eating at me. I fully understand the situation that the port is in. I was once at the port for a very short period. I was at the port at the time that the master plan, that was the 5-year master plan that was enacted in 2013 by this body, was being finalized. I was also at the port at the time when they were looking at implementing the 5-year tariff and what that application to the PUC would be. So, you know, I'm not speaking from a point of being completely naive. I was there and I was privy to a lot of it. And I clearly understand how the port, for the longest time, was caught in a time warp. That was the thing that shocked me the most when I was assigned to the port coming from the airport, was how it was caught in a time warp. It was in bad need of modernization, and it was well on its way to modernization when the military buildup was announced and funds were allocated in the tune of $30 million in the prior administration. What I don't want us to do right now, and I'm going through this litany because what I want to caution everybody is, while we nickel and dime and pick at everything that seems to suit us, we're putting pockets in the total picture that I think are, if I can rely and trust Gita's representation, is going to hurt our ability to borrow. And that's what I don't want to be a part of. I understand when we have contracts, sometimes there are things in contracts that are so ominous, you would wonder who would be the fool to sign something like this. But language is put in contracts that is there for good reason, for when things go wrong or when there's opportunities. But there's always protections both ways. But what I'm getting at here is, I sincerely believe that we've got some challenges ahead of us that maybe we're not owning up to right now. But we also have an opportunity to go out into the bond market and to get some badly needed money that can upgrade our port in the way that it needs to be upgraded. And I'm worried that if we tinker with what is in here in Article 2, titled Jose de Leon Guerrero Commercial Port Revenue Bonds and Other Indebtedness, that if we tinker with this to the point where it is not conducive to the bond market and to those that would purchase our bonds, then we're really being foolish. And I would just make the plea to the body. I understand where we want to go with this, but I also understand that maybe we're not in a position of entitlement, and that comes with not having the best credit rating or having the history or having anything. I know what it's like to be restricted when we were at the airport and we had these bond covenants that we thought were just ridiculous. But those were the terms. You want the money, you want the improvements, you know, you have to live with it this way. If you're in a position to make your own rules, better for you. But if you're not, then you're kind of stuck. And unfortunately, I think in Guam, we're kind of stuck. We really are in some things. When you're looking at $72.6 million, like that poor man who has to go to a type of lending institution over another lending institution because he would never make it past the first door in that one lending institution. He doesn't have the capital. He doesn't have the history. He has some blips on his history. That's the reality of today, I'm afraid. And what I want to go back to is, if in fact the statute as written is so antiquated that it's going to be more trouble than it's worth, then we do need to rewrite it. And if the experts are telling us that this is how it's going to fly for you, then maybe we just have to come to the terms that we're not in a good position to really have it the way we want all the way. But mostly what we want is we want to get a hold of the cash now while it's available before all the conditions get worse for different reasons, whether it's the pullback of the tax-exempt status for the port, or whether it's all these judgments coming down our throat and the courts lean on us. We don't know. but we know we're not in a good position. And we know we can be in a much worse position if we don't act quickly and if we don't act within reason. We've all perhaps been at times where we've been at the bottom of the barrel, and we know what that feels like. And we know how hard it is to get out of that bottom of the barrel. But there's steps you make, and sometimes it's not to your advantage. Someone takes advantage of your situation. But the point is, you're on the road to crawling up the side of the barrel. And if you can at least get to that point, you take those steps, whatever it is, to get yourself out. I'm growingly concerned about picking and choosing, because I can just see that at some point when you take one peg out of the whole picture, at some point you compromise the stability of the whole structure. And if we keep picking at it that way, I'm afraid that that's what we're doing. I don't know enough to write this section myself, and I don't know enough to tell you that taking one out is not going to compromise another. I think that that is at the level of bond counsel or perhaps some experts within GITA, but it's not at my level. And that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about the little things that we think are catchy and interesting, but in the context of the whole, it's always about the bigger picture and what it is. So I'm almost resigned to thinking that we're really just like that agency that's not so well off that we can't expect to call the shots as we want, and we're going to have to eat it, like our airport did at one point. When the FAA gave them all that money and put all these extreme conditions on them, that was the terms we lived by for many, many years. I always hated it and I never understood it, but you know, it's kind of like the guy with bad credit that gets liens on everything of any value that he owns, and you think that that's so unfair, but that's the terms that you live with when you're not in a position. And you're not entitled because you're not in a good position to call your own terms all the time. But, you know, contrary to what some people might believe, I understand the port. My heart has always been in the port. I understand the port's crucial component to the livelihoods of this island. I think in time, we're all going to pay dearly for these improvements. But it's one of those things, you either have it or you don't. And sometimes having it is going to cost you extremely. It's going to cost you at extreme measures, but you know, we've brought ourselves to this point as a government and as a community, and I don't know. I don't want to be resigned. I want to believe that we can fight for everything that we believe we deserve, but I sometimes wonder if we're really in a position to fight in this instance where someone's holding the purse and we're desperate. And I believe we're desperate right now to fix the piers. Perhaps, you know, there is a scaling down of 4 options with the building. I'm not going to argue that point. It's a business plan. But I think in terms of the bond covenants, we have to be a little more disciplined, and maybe at some point when we don't know better ourselves, I don't know better myself, the ins and outs, I think I have to defer to an expert who will in fact tell me if I'm being foolish in being so proud. And maybe that's what it is. It's just we're just battling here, and it's becoming very personal, and it's becoming very ugly, and it's becoming very mean. And nobody here means, I don't mean to mean the body, I mean just generally getting through this bill. It's a no-brainer. It's a bond borrowing bill. It's not like it doesn't happen ever, or doesn't happen often, or hasn't happened before, but we're just so hung up on it. So let's you know, I think we've reduced the interest rate, we've reduced the amount, but in terms of somebody telling us, is this going to fly or not, if we pick at it, I don't know that it's going to fly so well, and that's what scares me. So that's my two-piece. I just feel that we've really just got to move on, and hopefully when Gita comes, we can. It would be great if we had someone of a bond counsel caliber who could just say, you know, thumbs up or thumbs down. That's not real. That is real. That's a concession we can make. That would be impossible. But you know, time is what concerns me, because with all that's coming down and all the judgments that have come down against the port, and that could potentially in the upcoming year, we really have to have a reality check, I think, as a body. But if there's a chance to get some money in there to get things done, we also know the corrosive nature of the port. You know, time is always against you. That salt water eats. So thank you very much for allowing me to overextend my time to speak. And I just appreciate everyone's consideration in trying to think this through holistically, as opposed to line by line piecemeal.
Thank you very much, Senator Torres. Senators, just for your information, I do have Senator Tom Atta, then Speaker Cruz, and Senator Nelson is still in the lineup. We will not dispose of this particular amendment until Gita representative has an opportunity to be able to comment on it, but we will continue our discussion on it, and then we'll hear from either Tina or any other representative from the Guam Economic Development Authority. Also, you take a look at this particular proposal that's been proffered. I think that enough comments have been made, but I know that the speaker also has some additional insight he'd like to provide. Senator Tom Atta, you have the floor on the proposed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too share the sentiments of the retiring speaker, and I am very much concerned about making such a sweeping amendment, such as deleting the entire provision. And I would have to assume that when this bill was put together, bond counsel, in fact, had a chance to look through this stuff. And so for us to make that change without getting some kind of a feedback from bond counsel, I would be very concerned with. One of the things that has kind of concerned me with the discussions that have taken place this week, there seems to be and I don't know what's driving it, whether it's cynicism or maybe just being ultra-conservative, but it seems I keep hearing the undercurrent that the port has too much latitude, and we need to kind of tighten up that corral. And I'm concerned. I feel that we've done that where we should have, with respect to just how much should we really authorize for them to go out and borrow, how much the interest rate should be. But I think after that, we really need to give them as much latitude to be able to deal within this confined space that we're giving them. And so it was for that reason that I made that amendment earlier about removing that budget for each CIP project, because there's just too many variables that they have to deal with. And it may be that if we then hold them to that budget, that then they may have to end up with something that is less than what is really needed, simply because we have boxed them in to that budget. There's a lot of variables that they have to deal with. And so, you know, I can understand the concern about, for example, and the suggestion about why we should remove section 10210, because it just kind of presents a lot of unknowns out there that could come back to surprise us. But the consolation that I have is that after we finish here, that's not the end of it. they're going to put together their indenture. It's going to have to get vetted by the PUC. So there's more vetting, and then that's where I think the rubber really meets, the road. So because of that, I'm accepting some of the generalities that we have to deal with here. But I still think that we've got to be careful about tying the hands of the port any more than we have to, so that they are able to then deal with the variables and not have to come back here every time that those variables, arise. So I certainly would have an objection, and I would object to the deletion of this section 10210. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Ada. Speaker Cruz on the proposed amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is not the first amendment that the mover has made to try to remove sections. And if I remember her statements the first day, she had great consternation, concern about the fact that throughout these first 45 pages, there was a marked deletion of Imagatlahi as having anything to do with anything in this. The governor isn't being asked, nor is there a legislature being brought back to us. Once we pass these first 45 pages, what happens in the future doesn't include us. And the answer that we kept getting the first couple of days, at least she was getting, and we were receiving from Gita was, this is the way it's in the other authorities. This is the way it is in all the other authorities. Just this section, Mr. Chairman, 10210 that the mover is asking to remove reads, an indenture pursuant to these which bonds are issued may include and all covenants and agreements on the part of the authority as the board deems necessary or advisable, including without limiting generality of the foregoing and any one of the following. No mention of the governor, no mention of us, no mention of anybody else. And the same provision that Gita and whoever else has been proposing it from on front, they're saying this is exactly what's in the other authorities. Let me read you what GPA's is. GPA, section 8210. Coincidentally, the same 210 at the end. Covenants and agreements that may be contained in indenture. Same title. Now listen. An indenture pursuant to which bonds are issued and which is approved by legislation may include any and all such covenants and agreements on the part of the authority, the board, the territory, the governor, the director of administration, the treasurer, and the general manager, or any other officer or agency of the territory, the authority of the board are authorized in this article as the board may deem. Does that sound exactly like the one where it's the board? And the mover has been complaining since the beginning. There hasn't been one board member here to hear our concerns. GWA. Covenants and agreements that may be contained in an indenture. An indenture pursuant to which bonds or issues may include any and all covenants and agreements on the part of the government as Imagatlahi Guahan deems necessary or advisable, including, not limiting the generality, and then it goes on. But it has him in there. In the Guam International Airport, no general fund bonds shall be issued unless authorized by the bond in a bond resolution adopted and unless the legislature by statute approves the terms and conditions. In each of these, we have the governor, the legislature, and in GPA, it has everybody but my mother. By statutory construction, the way this is written, we are irrelevant as of today. And that's only just this one section, Mr. Chairman. When the mover of this first asked, she kept getting the answer, it's the way it is. That's the way it is. That's the way we have to have it. And on the verge of tears, she was asking, but why does it have to be? And I just looked just this one section. And it shows we have not been given the truth. And with the recent decision by the Supreme Court, and I keep trying to get legal counsel in all of you, I brought it to your attention, all of you, earlier this year. The way the court's interpreting statutory construction, a deletion in current legislation is going to be looked at as we didn't mean it this time. You're not there anymore. This breach of trust, and I'm calling it that, I could call it something else, on this one provision, is the basis for which I cannot and will not support this bill, and why I will support her legislation, her amendment, but really seriously. As I stated, when we prepared the committee report for this, 400 pages, and we talked about 80 million, 30 million, falling raw things at the hearings, things rotting.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. On that particular note, there was concrete falling out of the EQMR building. That is a safety issue. So in regards to trying to present that lightly, I'm going to take deference to that.
No, I'm just saying there wasn't another paragraph on 45 pages of this bill.
Mr. Speaker, I will entertain an amendment.
Delete the first 45 pages.
At a later time, after the disposition of this amendment. Senator Nelson.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Senator Abbott.
If I may, given the information that the retiring speaker has provided, I'm withdrawing my objection to the amendment that was being made.
Thank you, Senator Abbott. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't quite hear what the previous speaker just said. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to stand in support of this amendment. Yesterday, we went over what system was.
Senator Nelson, I'm sorry for interjecting. Can I just get a direct response from Ms. Garcia regarding some of the comments that the speaker made, just so that there's clarification, please?
Yes,
thank you,
Mr.
Senator
Chair.
Nelson.
Thank you.
Ms. Garcia?
My apologies for misleading anybody. That wasn't my intent. What I do want to clarify is that as it relates to Guam Power Authority, they were created as an autonomous agency, but in the early 70s, they were on the verge of a bond default. They were, as mentioned earlier, they were provided assistance, you know, because I wasn't there, but what I understand is that the power authorities back then appealed to the governor for assistance. They did not want to default on their bond. And I believe that there was also assistance from Department of Interior. And
Mr. Chairman, point of information.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Unfortunately, because of my age, I was there.
okay.
I was part of the negotiating team that was there for the bond, okay? So I'm just saying, is this provision in this bill the exact same thing that's in the GPA one, and does it not exclude the governor? And why? Why? I mean, at least the governor. I mean, in the GPA, include the governor. And it's strange that I'm the one that's saying that.
So,
But he is the mega law. Include him in the discussion. Don't write legislation and say it's going to be easier if we don't have to deal with him. I mean, I agree, but it's still, it should be in there so when the court reviews this and they refuse to come back, and future boards refuse to come back here, they don't say, well, statutory construction was, there was a time when you had a GPA, had everybody included except the Chief Justice. It went down to the governor and the legislature, and now this one says no one except the board.
okay.
Then it's just the board because it doesn't include anybody else.
Thank you, Speaker Cruz.
So in that case, the governor was inserted at that time. Since then, we have, GWA does not have the governor in there because, again, in the beginning of the indenture, in the beginning of this section, it states clearly that the port, with the assistance of GITA, which in its own mandate says we have to make sure that there is legislative
Again, point
authority.
of information, you're wrong again on GWA. GWA reads 51A811. An indenture pursuant to the bonds is issued and agreements on the part of the government as Imagalahi Guahan deems necessary and advisable. It doesn't include the legislature, but it does include Imagalahi. You guys just include the Imagalahi or something in this. That's all she's been asking since the beginning. Why did we, in this 45 pages, exclude Imagalahi?
I'm looking at what was certified when we did the last GWA bond, section 14210. And again, I don't know, that was what was certified in the bond documents. In that section, it is reflective of this, where it says on the part of the authority as the board deems necessary or advisable. So that's what was certified in the GWA statute when we last did this in when was this certified? And this was certified in 2016 by the compiler. And, you know, I don't know if we're going to go back to her and say you didn't pick up the correct version, but that was the version that was certified in the 2016 bond documents. And that's what we have presented here, where in the beginning there is a requirement that they get legislative approval, governor's signature, but then because they're an autonomous agency, they're not, but they're not included here because it's already assumed in the beginning that any indenture would require legislative approval and the governor's approval. So we were, you know, so that's what's reflected in GWA's certified legislation, and that's what was put here. So,
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the discussion. I will entertain an amendment if, in fact, any of our colleagues would like to insert the governor and Elias Turenguahan into the additional oversight based on the explanation that was provided by Gita. Senator Nelson, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I stand in support of this amendment, and I'd like to make an amendment to the amendment to include the Governor of Guam and the Legislature of Guam.
I'm sorry, Senator
And if you
Nelson, the
just-
amendment is to delete subsection 10210
Oh, sure.
on page 28 through page 33. So I will entertain your subsequent amendment after we dispose of this,
Thank you,
because
Mr. Chair.
this amendment is to delete the entire section. Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. Senator St. Nicholas, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to clarify a couple of things. First of all, just for the benefit of the listening audience, this bill does two things. The first 45 pages rewrites the entire borrowing authorization statute for the port. And the last 4 pages, that's where the actual borrowing authorization is for the projects. This body at this time in this discussion is not debating the projects. What we're debating is, are we going to rewrite with this measure the entire borrowing authorization statute of the port? The case that's been made by Gita for attaching these two things together, which really are two separate issues. The case is that by rewriting this borrowing authorization statute, the port will, and this is Gita's claim, be aligned with the other autonomous agencies. But as was brought up by the speaker, that is not the case. This will actually give the port a very different kind of borrowing authorization. And it is different in that it would not in any way involve anyone who is elected by the people of Guam. With GPA and GWA, they have the CCU. With the airport, they have at least Imagalahi. And as the speaker mentioned in statutory construction, while it is practice for us right now to have a legislatura involved in approving an indenture, that isn't necessarily in the Organic Act. Because based on our readings of the Organic Act, if it is a general obligation, it is written in the Organic Act. But if it is not a general obligation, it's somewhat ambiguous. And that ambiguity, plus the statutory construction implied in this striking of this Article 2 and in this rewrite, could potentially open the door for debt to be able to be taken on by the port without the need for the approval of the legislatura. And that is what is very concerning about this section that's being amended. Because what section 10210 does on page 28, line 22, and thereon, is it's a pre-authorization for any future indentures. A legislatura is saying by passing this section that we are okay with any indenture that includes these provisions. And that is concerning because not only does it pre-authorize these provisions, but it, from a statutorily constructed perspective, is a further abdication of the need for a legislatura to be involved in the approval of the debt. It can be implied that because we're passing these pre-authorizations, the legislatura is saying, you don't need to come back to us if it contains these things. What is additionally concerning is whenever we approve any bond authorization, it's usually, and this is based on what I've seen, it's the amount, it's the cap on the interest rate, and it's what the funds are going to be used for, and it's the duration of the debt. But we do not, even in other bonds that we've authorized, get into the details of the indenture. And so I would argue that it's implied that because the legislatura is involved in approving the bond, that the indenture is something that we're going to be okay with, but at least the legislature was involved. This pre-authorization language could technically, in my opinion, be construed as the legislature saying, go ahead and do it if it contains these things. And that is why I'm of the opinion, and I share the opinion of the speaker, that this entire Section 1, this rewrite of the Article 2 statute, is something that I think should handle entirely separately. I think we should stay focused on debating the merits and terms and conditions of the bond that the port is pursuing. And I think that we should reconsider the rewrite of the borrowing authorization statute until we've really vetted that legislation on a separate matter. Because by passing this, if we pass this Section 1 and rewrite this entire statute, we will have effectively transformed the entire borrowing process of the port going forward. It's not just attached to this one borrowing. Any future borrowing would follow this process. And if by striking certain things out and by adding certain things in and by excluding the public officials, it very well could be construed as allowing the port to go ahead and proceed with its own borrowings beyond this. I would advise that we stay focused strictly on the bond that's been proposed and testified to at great length by the port. Even the details of that, which we have debated interchangeably with this Section 1, is something that we have tried to get a better handle on. And just as a case in point, if we pass this Section 1, it is arguable that we wouldn't even have those kind of debates in the future. And the reason why this is so necessary, the reason why it's necessary for us to have these debates is because every debt that this port takes on that's tied to tariffs is an increase or a cost that needs to be borne by the people of Guam, the consumers. Everything you consume that comes through the port is going to have the cost of any debt service attached to it. And even with GPA and GWA having the CCU, which is elected by the people of Guam, we still see concerns from our public about the impact of all the debt service on their power bills and on their water bills. What more the impact of debt service on the cost of food, on the cost of gas, on the cost of automobiles, on the cost of home building materials, on the cost of practically anything that comes into our port. So I support the amendment. I further support the idea that we should just remove the Section 1 entirely, work with GITA, work with the port, and talk strictly about the borrowing that's on the table and not change the entire borrowing statute for any future debt that may or may not involve the people of Guam based on how this is written. I appreciate the attempts of the mover of the amendment to try and go in and piece by piece address what may or may not be concerns. But I also share the concerns of the chair that by going in and making these adjustments, are we thereby foregoing the entire point of having this section altogether? Which just further underscores the need for us to really ask ourselves, is this section necessary at this time? And I would proffer that it is not. And I think that in the interest of considering the original borrowing, that is the main thrust of why so many people have testified in favor of this legislation, I think that we should stay focused strictly on that issue and forego taking this action at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Sir Nicholas. Just for some clarification, for the members of the body on page 25, subsection 10203, the board, through the Guam Economic Development Authority, has the power and hereby authorized to be able to proceed with any financing, whether it's bond financing and loan financing. And then you take a look at the provision under subsection 50103K with the Guam Economic Development Authority, the corporation shall not issue or sell any bond without the approval of a legislature in Guam of the terms and conditions of the bond. So if you take a look and you join the two provisions, one of the Guam Economic Development Authority, in which this provision allows the port through the Guam Economic Development Authority to acquire bond financing or loan financing, GITA shall not proceed with any consideration without the legislature being actively involved. So I wanted to ensure that there's clarification in the presentation of information. Yes, the legislature as well as the Magalahin Guahan are actively involved in any loan financing or bond financing under the GIDA statute, of which this provision provides for the Port Authority to go through GIDA for any loan or bond financing. So I wanted to provide that tie-in and that clarification. And I will, and I have stated that I am open to accepting for discussion any amendment that would further clarify that, in fact, the legislature and the governor will be part and parcel of anything under the mandate of the Port Authority of Guam. So on that note, thank you, Senator San Nicolas. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? Once again, the proposed amendment is to delete subsection 10210 from page 28 through page 33. Any further discussion? If not, Vice Speaker Talai, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to ask the GIDA, can you remind us how long this borrowing, this particular revenue bond is intended to be for? How long will we be making payments on that bond?
I'm sorry, we're running analysis for both 25-year and 30-year bonds.
All right. Yes, I share all the concerns that have been expressed. They're all valid. It's true that, and I think part of it stems from the change in the bond process over the years. There were times when we really were desperate and we gave any authority to the agency because we were desperate. And there were times when we were in a rush, and there were times when we pretty much already knew the terms and we approved. But I think the basic process used to be that the legislature gave some kind of parameters to start the process. They would go out and try to get options, come back with an indenture. And it was the indenture itself that the legislature approved or disapproved. And that's the big difference here. And I just think that that evolved over time because as a time-saving mechanism, and we thought that we could control the indentures, or we thought that we could not control those indentures at all. But if we are not going to control the indentures, we have such a little role. I mean, the port, if it's, and it would be, I believe a great disservice to the people of Guam to relinquish that role. We've already delegated to the port much power. To all the autonomous agencies, much autonomy and power and the ability to say, no, I don't have to contribute anything to the rest of the government of Guam. We've given them huge benefits like that. But I just think that there are some things that the government should not give up, and we should not give it up right now if we don't know. And I totally agree that when we used to when the legislature used to approve indentures, my recollection is that the bond council would be here and be able to answer all the questions that came up regarding the indenture itself, as to the language, if we remove one section. And of course, I do have concerns that if we remove this section, what does it do? But that is, like some of the previous speakers says, it really points to the bill. The bill does two things. And by saying that we are changing the port statute forever, we're also saying that we allow these things to be put in the indenture in this one bond that's before us. And we're not really being specific as to what the indenture is going to show for this one bond before us. We're delegating all that out. And that's my concern. And so, I can see the benefit of it in certain occasions, but I just think at this point, we can be very specific. And we can make the decision later whether we want to delegate this authority permanently to, all autonomous agencies. But if we're not, I don't believe that's a good decision. And we should today, because it's in front of us, just just do the work for the one particular revenue bond. And I asked about how long the bond's going to be is because these indentures that restrict the port and restrict the government of Guam, that we are allowing someone else to put in there without our additional review, those are going to be in place for 25, at a minimum 25 years, right? Or 30 years. And this is exactly the situation that previous speakers have also said, that this is the same situation we face with the other autonomous agencies, and maybe it's a matter of, I don't believe we are that desperate or that we should act that desperately. In fact, I think we should act quickly and we should act wisely, and we should not act desperately, not today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Speaker. I noticed, okay, Speaker is back in the room. I was going to suspend voting until the Speaker returned. But Senators, just for your information, according to the code, these provisions of borrowing authorization, the last date was back in 1984 when changes were made to the Port Authority's enacting legislation. So if you're looking at 33 years with this provision that is being proposed by the Bond Council through the Guam Economic Development Authority, I'm going to have to reemphasize one of the statements that was made by our colleagues in the hall, is that I would reserve making any significant amendments to this particular provision, especially in light of it being reviewed by Bond Council, as well as the market, making sure that the marketability of any bond financing is available. On the amendment by Vice Speaker.
Could I just say one more thing, please? It's just that there is a difference between modernizing our statutes and making it so easy, of course, for Bond Council and bond sellers to go out there and do this for us, and waiving all of our review of the terms. And there's a difference, but we never
Madam Vice
chosen
Speaker,
to
that's
do
exactly why we are before this body entertaining Bill 157. On Vice Speaker Talai's amendment on page 28 to delete subsection 10210 through page 33, there's been an objection. All those in... Any objections? There's an objection on the floor. All those in favor of the proposed amendment, please signify by raising your right hand. Amendment fails. Vice Speaker Talai, we're still on page 33. You still have the floor.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to point out again on page 39, it talks about authorizing refunding, and I guess I just wanted to get some clarification whether that refunding would require legislative approval after passage of this statute. And then I want to point us to, on page 39, line 25, and this says we're going to mirror previous, this sounds so strange to me to be put into our bond statute, and so I feel like, I want to delete these words on line 25 all the way to line 1 on the next page, that if we're going to do this, then let's just do it. Let's not say we're doing it in order to mirror the previous pledge allowed GPA or anyone else, and just start with the government of Guam hereby pledges, and just, so that's my amendment, just to delete those lines.
Madam Vice Speaker, if you can clarify your amendment again. It's on page 39.
On page 20, I'm sorry, page 39, line 25.
Line 25.
Start with the words "in order to mirror," and just delete those all the way to the entire line 1 on page 40.
The first line on page 40?
Yes.
The Vice Speaker Talai's amendment that she's proffered is on line 25, page 39, starting with the words "in order to mirror," to delete that entire phrase to the top of page 40. On that amendment, any discussion?
Mr. Chair, just to be
yes,
clear.
Senator Espadon, on the amendment.
Just to be clear,
On page 40, what lines exactly?
Just the first line,
Just the very
to
first
the
line?
conclusion of Guam Waterworks Authority.
Okay. If we may have a minute to read it in full.
Yes, and
once it's
I'm also
finished.
going to make an amendment to remove subsections C and D.
Let's entertain your initial amendment, Madam Vice Speaker. Senator Espadon, you have clarity?
Well, no, now if, bottom line, I just need a little time to read and digest, because with the removal of those lines, what are the implications really to the whole section? And so again, it's very hard to come up with a position either way until you can understand the ramifications. So if I may just ask for an extra minute or two to read it.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. Ms. Garcia?
Again, I apologize. Our intent is to be fully transparent to the senators, and what again here is, it's in here is what's again in the Guam Waterworks statute that was passed. And our whole intent, again, in updating the statute is that the initial port authorization was written in 1975. And what we have here presented is a mirror of what was done for Guam Waterworks Authority. And, you know, our intent is not to put anything in there that isn't already existing. And as far as the conditions and again, it's just saying, you know, this is what may be asked for, and it's been asked for in the past. And, you know, as much as we can, we won't give it up if we don't have to. But again, because we're going out with a new credit, we want to, you know, make it, hopefully get the same investment grade credit that Guam Waterworks has. And so that's why we're trying to make that, these statements here, and that's why it was rewritten this way.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? Vice Speaker Talai, did you want to close? I'm sorry, Senator Espadon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My mind is working at 3/4 speed, so excuse me for being a little slow this morning. The full sentence, I mean, this full paragraph, 10.229, pledged by the government of Guam. If Ms. Garcia could just perhaps give us her interpretation of what this really says, it would be helpful.
The intent of this whole section, again, is the government of Guam is recognizing what it means for port to be an autonomous agency. Similar to how we've set up autonomous agencies in waterworks, in airport, and power in some instances outside of their one issue. So what we found was the government stating and making a statement that we preserve the, you know, we were given, Port Authority is given autonomy. What does that autonomy mean? It's the same thing that we meant for Guam Power Authority, for Guam Airport, and Waterworks, to, again, exactly what we state there, to successfully enter the financial markets, and to model the language that authorized the debt for the previous autonomous agencies. And again, stating here that recognizing that the Guam PUC has been authorized, or it has the ability or the power to maintain the rate setting, and we're not going to interfere with that, we being the government of Guam. The bondholders, again, whatever we approve here in this article and in the indenture, which we clearly state what are those conditions, will be also recognized, and to, you know, and so on. So I think that was the intent of this section, was to make the statement that that we've made previously, that the government of Guam will allow the port to do what port does, and will not try to, again, interfere with their operations, try and touch their funds to fulfill our need, our other needs. So again, that's why that section was put in.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Senator Espadon, you still have the floor.
Thank you. You know, Ms. Garcia, do you have the bill in front of you? Yeah, page 39. On line 23, the beginning of the sentence is, it goes on, the government also is fully committed to ensuring that bondholders are protected to ensure full and timely payments of their bonds. Now, when we say that we're fully committed, what exactly does that mean?
So that's the statement that we're making, and it's supported by the following: A, B, C, and D. These are this is how we are going to fully commit. So
Okay.
within that, we commit that we're not going to interfere with Guam PUC.
Okay.
We're not going to change anything. We're going to respect what the indenture approves,
All right.
and so on. And then lastly,
Right.
and D, not to transfer any funds for
All right.
non-system.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And I just want to make sure, because now when we come to the amendment itself to delete the section that's being moved to be deleted, you got no problem with it, right? Because it really has no bearing on the effect of what the pledge and commitment of the government is going to be in making sure that the Port Authority has that ability to do what the port does, right? So there is no consequence whatsoever to delete this section, correct?
I see what you're reading, and I can agree with what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? If not, once again, the proposed amendment is on page 39, line 25, to delete the phrase "in order to mirror" all the way to the first line on page 40 to conclude with Guam Waterworks Authority. On that amendment, Madam Vice Speaker, any final comments? On the amendment, all those in favor, any objections? No objections? So ordered. Thank you, Madam Vice Speaker. You still have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. I would like to move to delete subsection C and D. Again, this is an attempt by me and hopefully by the legislature to, the bond people, they're going to read this and they're going to see what options they have, and they're going to go for the maximum benefit to them that they can get. And I feel like in order to negotiate, we have to not give it away. We don't have to. So subsection C says that for the next 30 years, or the length of this bond in particular, the port will have the exclusive right to operate within Guam any system operated by the government or its designees by preventing the acquisition, operation, maintenance, or permitting of any instrumentality of the government or any other public or private agency, entity, or person to operate a separate and competitive system. And Senator Nelson read out the definition of system earlier in our discussion yesterday, and the system includes, I mean, all the activity. And I'm not saying that we're going to go out and compete against the port. I don't think anybody has any plans to do that, but I can't predict the future, and I just think that we don't need to preclude anyone from trying to operate some new industry in Guam that we shouldn't. And I don't think it's necessary, again, for this particular indenture, because we are pledging all the revenue, and we have raised the tariffs to guarantee the revenue. And we have done, the port actually has done the work to guarantee this revenue to bondholders. And we are pledging in all other kinds of ways with a trustee and everything else that protects the revenue for this revenue bond. And I don't think for this revenue bond, we need to pledge all these other things by the government of Guam. And so subsection C, affects any other public or private agency. And D,
Madam Vice Speaker, I'd like to caution you on D, because there's an exception clause, with the exception of annual supplemental annuities and COLA contributions paid by the authority. You delete that section, then,
No.
because that's one of the key exception provisions that continues to allow this entity to pay supplemental annuity and COLA to
Yes,
its former
because
employees.
D would prohibit the agency from doing anything else that we ask it to do. If we want to start up a cruise industry and the
I'm just
legislature
referring to
needs
the
to
exception.
implement
Point of
Madam
that
Vice
order.
type
Speaker,
of
I'm just
law.
referring to the exception clause.
I understand,
Point
and
of
I'm
order,
just saying
Mr.
that if,
Chairman. Point of order.
Yes, stay your point of order, Senator Espadon.
Mr. Chairman, the motion is to delete two different subsections. I request that we bifurcate those two issues.
No objection to bifurcating.
And do one section at a time.
Thank you, Senator Espadon.
Thank
On
you.
the suggestion and the concurrence of the mover of the amendment, we're going to proceed with the amendment by Vice Speaker Talai to delete subsection C. On that particular note, any further discussion? If not, Senator Espadon, you're recognized on the First Amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure I can agree with the deletion of this section, because when I had asked Gita to really explain their understanding and perhaps clarify for us this whole section, section 10.229, and what it means, and basically it's entitled Pledge by the Government of Guam. Under Section C, what Government Guam is pledging is that we will protect the exclusive right of the port to operate or maintain within Guam its system, and we protect the port by allowing them to do what they do. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, saying that in exchange for going to the bond market, we are saying, as a government, that the port is the Port Authority of Guam. They have the right, they have that ability given to them by the legislature to operate as the port. That's all this is saying. By its deletion, are we going to send a message that we are open to possibly others coming in and setting up something else? Not that there's any room anywhere to do it, but I'm still not sure of the necessity to eliminate this section, because this is a pledge by the government to the bond market out there that we will ensure that the port will continue to operate as the port. That's the way I read this, and someone correct me if I'm wrong. I'm open to that. So I'm not sure I can support this amendment without further discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. Speaker Cruz on the proposed amendment.
Just on exactly what the system means and what might happen in the future. You all recall yesterday Senator Nelson read out the definition of system, which includes the Hagatna Boat Basin. I'm not sure, because it's going to happen tonight, but HRRA is doing its exposition of the Hagatna of the 21st century. And I'm not sure what they're planning for the Hagatna Boat Basin. If that drone fly-through that they showed before, there may be some major changes to the boat basin and maybe its ownership. I'm not sure if that's part, so I just bring that up as part of the definition of the system.
So noted. Thank you, Speaker Cruz. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? If not, Vice Speaker Talai, would you like to close?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. And I appreciate the concerns that were raised, but I would also like to point the body to look at 10230. And this is throughout the bill. You'll see instances where there's repetitive types of promises made by the government of Guam. So here we are promising again that we will limit acquisition. I mean, in 10230, we're promising to limit acquisition, ownership, operation by the government of Guam of enterprises which compete with the system. which are necessary or desirable for the security of bonds issued pursuant to this article. And I like that section because, again, we're protecting what's necessary for the issuance of these bonds. And what's necessary for that is that the port remains solvent, that it pays its operations, and that the port makes the revenue that is necessary, and that we put that revenue into the lockbox and all those protections throughout this bill. So I'm saying that subsection C on line 10, particularly lines 13 through 15, it's just too much to promise. It's not necessary when we are pledging with everything we've got, all the revenue of the port to protect the bondholders. We don't need to protect all other industry of the government or private agencies to do that. I think PUC, when they approved the tariffs, said this is viable. Right now, it's viable. And they did not require any kind of language like this to say that it's viable, that this revenue would be enough to protect the bondholders. They said it was a financially sound for the port. And so that's why I am asking that we delete subsection C. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Speaker Talai. Ms. Garcia, you have any comments on the deletion of this section?
So these, again, within the indenture, what we want to state here is that the government will not, we want to protect the port and their revenue and their current exclusivity. And so should the government 10 years down the line make a policy call to sell the port to a private operator, they would have to pay off this bond. They would, to get out of this. So that's kind of why this provision is in there, that we won't allow it unless, we commit to, again, allowing the port to do their jobs and to be the, exclusive right of the authority, exclusive right of the authority to operate the port and their systems. And so if there are any portions of this that, again, a private operator wants to take over, then they would have to consider paying off the bonds in order to not conflict with this. And so I think that also pertains to future legislatures. If they want to sell the port and be it a Ganya, they would have to take into consideration that there's a debt and there are provisions that will, in order to allow them to move forward, they would have to pay off the port debt.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. On the amendment by Vice Speaker
Mr. Chair, I just want to point out that the language actually doesn't talk about selling assets of the port. It talks about operating a separate and competitive system. So, yes, this is something no one has foreseen, but I just think that we, at this point, need to keep those options open.
Thank you very much, Vice Speaker. On the amendment to delete subsection C on page 40, all those, there's been an objection. All those in favor of the amendment, please signify by raising your hands. Amendment fails. Vice Speaker Talai, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to make a motion to delete subsection D.
On the proposed amendment to delete subsection D in its entirety,
if I
on
could
page
just
40.
explain, and I heard your concern, Mr. Chair, but I think I share your concerns, is that the government, when it required the port to pay COLA to its employees and other things that the government requires all of its agencies, even if they're autonomous, to do, I want to remove subsection D so that the government can continue to do that. And so that, but by leaving subsection D in here, we are saying that for the next 30 years, the government cannot transfer any additional non-system operating responsibilities or mandates to the Port Authority of Guam. And I have none that I am proposing. I don't think anyone in here is proposing any, but for the next 30 years, do we really know what we might need to transfer to the Port Authority of Guam. And that's why I think COLA would be protected by deleting subsection D. We wouldn't need the exception because we would continue to allow the legislature and the people of Guam to have that flexibility for the next 30 years.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Speaker. I just highlighted that exception clause for clarity so that if in fact the bond council or any potential bond investor would like to take a look at the enabling legislation, it already recognizes that there are two obligations on the part of the Port Authority that has to be sustained. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clarified. On the amendment by Vice Speaker Talai to delete the entirety of subsection D, page 40, any discussion? Senator Espadon, you recognize.
Again, my mind is operating at 3/4 speed, so I'm going to have to read this aloud, in essence. And we're saying that Guam, or the government of Guam, pledges not to transfer any additional non-system operating responsibilities and other unfunded mandates to the authority without providing for the payment of the cost of such additional responsibilities, and then et cetera, on the COLA contributions. And so we're saying that we are going to pledge not to give the port any more responsibilities that are not within the system right now unless we pay for those added responsibilities that could conceivably be placed upon them. I'm not sure that's I'm not sure that's unreasonable, because the port has a big enough mandate as it is. And if we are going to transfer, if the government through the legislature decides to mandate non-system operating responsibilities that really might be tangent but not necessarily totally relevant to port operations, then it seems incumbent upon us to make sure that we pay for the additional costs of the operations that we would transfer to the port. By eliminating this, that then opens up the floodgates to say, well then, and even though there's nothing on the table right now, it does open up the floodgates to say, well then, we can transfer non-operational systems to the port without having to pay for it. And so I'm not sure there's any real danger in leaving this in.
Senator Espadon, did you want Senator Brown to respond?
If I may
wouldn't mind
respond. Make a comment?
I wouldn't mind her perspective.
If I may
Senator
respond.
Senator Brown, would you like to comment on this Senator Espadon's statement?
Thank you very much, Senator Espaldon. I concur with you. I think at the beginning and the end of the day, in order to have a fully autonomous agency, the purpose was to focus on our primary mission. And historically in the government of Guam, that was not always the case. That's one of the main reasons we were, during my time, created the CCU, because we did in the past, as with the Port of Guam, in the more recent history, because it has not had these type of structures as GWA, GPA, or even the airport, where you've had decisions that have been made in the past taking port resources for other purposes other than port operations. And you've had the financial resources of the port that have been extracted out, sometimes indirectly. In the past, there have been situations where employees were hired from the port, paid for by the port, never worked a day at the port. Those are indirect. You have some of those, funny contracts in the past that really were not in the interest of the port. But those decisions happened. So at the end of the day, the focus is to ensure that the port's one primary mission is to ensure that it can address proper cargo movement and ensure that the revenues of the port are reinvested back into the port. I think we're here today, unfortunately, because that's the evidence is there. However, whatever, the evidence is there that did not consistently happen in the past, even during a time when the port was generating far more revenue than it is today. Those monies, I don't know where they went. I mean, they had, 50 plus unclassified employees that were created at the Port Authority of Guam. Just like that. For what purpose? To do what? To add, to complement? That's the kind of abuse, unfortunately, that detracted these financial resources from being reinvested back into the utility, and they've not been addressed. So at the end of the day, it's really to make sure that the mission is there, because there have been experiences where those resources have been extracted for non-port related business.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Espadon, you still have the floor.
Well, I believe that the mover of the amendment would like to also add in, and before I either make an objection or not, I would be open to hearing what she has to say.
After yourself is going to be Speaker Cruz, but Vice Speaker Talai, did you want to?
I would just like to say, I agree. I mean, and when those instances come up where somebody wants to put some extra burden on any autonomous agency, we're going to have a public hearing. They're going to have to put that out in the public, and the port is very capable of defending itself against those types of things. But when we look at just the language here, it's very clear. Even COLA would have been prohibited to pay their own employees or their own retirees COLA or annual supplemental annuity. What if we change the retirement contribution rate? I mean, are we going to be prohibited from the court increasing its retirement contribution rate? Things like that. I mean, it's not necessary, again, for the one revenue bond that we're passing, because the one revenue bond that we are passing has pledged the revenues, and we cannot affect those revenues. We're not, there's nothing we can do that's going to affect those revenues. In fact, I mean, that's our first promise, is that we're giving all the revenue, the new tariffs, everything, to take care of this one revenue bond. So that's why I'm saying this is not necessary for this one revenue bond. If you want to pass a bill like this for the Port Authority for the future and say nobody can do anything with the port ever, maybe let's do that separately, because for this one revenue bond, it's not necessary. That's why it's a revenue bond. We're protecting it with our revenue. And all the promises that we make throughout this bill, there's so many limits on the government of Guam and on the port after this one revenue bond is passed. And I just don't think they need an additional one like this, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Talai. Senator Espadon, you still have the floor, and then Speaker Cruz.
Well, since it's a committee of the whole, I'll reserve the right to come back after hearing the other speakers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Speaker Cruz, you have the floor. On the amendment.
On the amendment, just as a question of what exactly is within the system. The island is currently under biodiversity threat with all the strange things that are coming in, mostly through the port, because that's our main port of entry. The issue of who builds customs and quarantine, the enclosed warehouse that they need to check for strange bugs or for drugs, is that a system cost that's going to be prohibited unless the legislature pays for it, or unless Customs and Quarantine pays for it and increases their fees and charges the port and its customers more money to clear everything? People are wondering, and I'm just saying what exactly is or is not included. And I'm just saying that's one of those gray areas. I admit that the 50 employees aren't. And the comment that they're not making enough money, I may take that up in a little bit as to whether or not they can afford this. But just on this point, what exactly the mission is, and to exclude or to not consider Customs and Quarantine part of the mission, and part of the mission to keep drugs and bugs out of the island, that may be a cost that somebody's going to have to be concerned with. And if we pass legislation saying something has to be done, who pays for it?
Thank you very much, Speaker Cruz. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? Senator Espadon, you reserve your opportunity to speak before we close.
No, actually, I appreciate the prior speaker's comment. The whole issue about Customs and Quarantine, and in their hearing on the budget and on other matters, have always argued that they perhaps belong as part of the port system. I mean, you know, as a partner within the port system. So it gives me, that argument gives me pause in terms of whether I should object to this or not, of this amendment, because there should be a place for customs and quarantine and the inspection for invasive species and whatnot to be part of, of the partnership with the port. And again, still deliberating in my mind. I'm just buying time as I talk, right, to figure it out in my own head how I'm going to fall on this vote. But
one way to deal with that, good Senator, is to take a look at the definition of system,
yes,
and incorporate that particular component.
I fully understand that, but again, when you start talking about the customs and quarantine issue, it was not part of the system. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. Senator Esteves, on the proposed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clear up a couple of things with regards to custom and them not being non-system operating. Non-system operating responsibilities. So customs is a necessity. While they're not a part of the system, they're a necessity for customs or for the port to do their job. So what we're talking about is placing or transferring that responsibility. There's no need for the government to transfer that responsibility on the port to say, hey, port, you need to work with customs and quarantine, you need to do this and that. There doesn't even need to be a statute, anything additional, because that necessity and that requirement is already there. Without customs, no cargo moves, whether it's at the airport or the Port Authority of Guam. So to kind of say, well, if we do this, then customs can't do their job. No, the customs has a requirement, and the port has a requirement. It's a symbiotic relationship. Now, if we're concerned with customs raising the cost, whether it's the port eating the cost whether it's the port having to increase their rate because we transfer the responsibility onto the port to maintain customs, it's going to go to the people and the consumer. Whether it's customs that reimburse their costs, it's going to go to the consumers. Either way, whoever the responsibility is on, it's going to end up going to the consumers because that's just the way they're funded through a cost recovery method. Now, if you're overly concerned about the cost, minus the warehouse, if customs were to be at 100% fully operating capacity with a 5-year growth plan at the port, you're looking at a 0.00023 increase in tariffs per ton. That's the estimates they have right now, and that's just on their operational budget. If you were to include the warehouse, the port has every opportunity as an autonomous agency to work out a negotiation with customs as a tenant. And whether it's the port having to increase their rates to accommodate that, or the customs, it's still going to be the same result. So if there's a concern on how we're going to get there, it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. If we, as stated before, if we want to support and beef up operations of customs at the port, it's going to come at a cost, regardless. Who's the one who's going to initiate that cost? I think that's really a matter of semantics, but it'll have to happen.
On the proposed amendment on page 40 for the deletion subsection D, Speaker Cruz, you have an additional comment?
Yes, just on the, not countering, but just the mover of the amendment since the beginning has been concerned about and learning from what has happened at the other port of entry. That because of the covenants that were put into the bonds for the airport, they cannot provide quote-unquote free services, or at least that's what we were told the last hearing we had with Customs at the airport here. And I've asked them for a copy of the lease, that they have to charge everybody, including Customs and Quarantine. But it's a symbiotic relationship, as was stated. They cannot operate without them. They are as important as the stevedores. Because if they don't clear anything, nothing comes onto the land. And I'm just saying, we're trying to find out whether or not it's absolutely necessary to put into the bond a provision that you can't take care of your symbiotic Siamese twin. on a free service rather than the airport charging $3 million to customs. And when they can't raise it in fees, we have to provide for it in our budget.
Thank you very much, Speaker Cruz. Any final comments on the proposed amendment?
Just to
If
add
not,
to that.
yes, Senator Stubbs.
It really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. If you were to take the airport, and whether the airport gives it away for free and gives away the farm, the airport has to recover those costs. So they're going to increase their fees and the reimbursements that they're allowed by the FAA to the carriers. Or whether Customs submits their reimbursement for what they pay to the airport, and then the airport reevaluates and increases their rates to the carriers, it's still going to happen, whether it's the airport doing it or if it's going through Customs. Either way, nothing's for free. No one's giving anything away for free. And when you're talking about an autonomous agency that has to survive, if they're not giving it away for free, they're recovering those costs somewhere else. So it really, really doesn't matter who initiates that. It doesn't matter at all. The cost is going to be at the end. It just matters of who's initiating that. So somebody's going to have to pay for it at the end of the day. So there's nothing that's free. We all know that. Nothing's free. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. On the proposed amendment to delete sub-item D on page 40, discussion has concluded. All those in favor, any objection, first of all? There's been an objection. All those in favor of the deletion of sub-item D on page 40, please signify by raising your hands. Motion fails. Senators, we are going to break until 2 p.m. this afternoon, and we will continue on page 41 with Vice Speaker Talahi. I understand, Senator Tamara, you also would like to comment on the proposal. Anyone else who would like to comment on the proposal, please, so that we can either continue the dialogue or conclude the discussion. I know, Senator Siniclis, you requested that we come back to you at a later time. Thank you, Senators.